Hi everyone, and happy Wednesday! All that snow I showed you in last week's video was gone within a 24-hour period. So by Thursday morning of last week, all the snow was gone, unfortunately. But we were left with another gift, and I'll share that with you next week on Christmas Day. This is the first time in the 4 years I've been on YouTube that one of my videos is actually going to go live on Christmas Day, so it's kind of fun. And I'll share what Mother Nature left us as a gift. And yeah, all the snow is gone, so I'm a little sad about that, but that's okay. It's still really beautiful outside. And like last week, I was inspired to create a geologic abstract, and this week, being that there is no snow on the ground and the forest looks almost like a spring forest, I'm inspired to create another geologic abstract. And I really love how it turned out. I think it's super easy to create. It's one of my shorter videos in a while. Hopefully it'll be easy to follow, and I would love to have you join me in painting this week's project. So if you're ready, grab your paint supplies, or if you'd prefer, grab yourself a cup of your favorite brew, sit down, relax, and enjoy the video. Let's get going with the painting process. No, your eyes are not playing tricks on you. I recorded the first part of this video, but it was very blurry, so I decided to omit it. It was basically me just putting a very, very light wash of color over the whole entire surface of my oh God. I am tired. Putting a light wash of color over my whole entire piece of paper, and then I added some salt and let it dry. So I think the color I added was titanium buff or buff titanium, depending on the brand you buy it from. They're somewhat similar, sometimes a little bit different, but they should offer you similar results regardless of the one you decide to use. As I've mentioned in many of my videos previously, I'm a very intuitive painter, and so that usually means that I sort of go along with whatever my intuition is calling me to do. And sometimes in the beginning, that means it's going to look a little bit like a mess. And oftentimes people tell me they were sort of scratching their heads in the beginning and then somehow it turned around. And that's how it usually works out for me. I really have become very good at trusting in the creative process and trusting in my abilities to turn things around. And so I just let my gut guide me and make decisions as I go along, and every decision guides the next decision. And so right now it looks very indistinct. I have a slight idea of what it is I'm trying to create, but I'm just going to let it play out the way it wants to play out. Oftentimes when I am applying my first layers of color, I not only use a lot of pigment, but I can also use a lot of water. And in those areas where there is more pigment and water, I like to come in, if I'm going to add salt, with more coarse grain salt. I find that the coarse grain salt reacts better to the areas in the painting that has a little bit more water. And then in the areas where I apply paint, where the paint is more damp than very wet, I like to add some finer grain salt, and I find that this creates some different textures that I also like. And I find textures created by salt in geologic abstracts to be particularly interesting because it sort of mimics what's happening in nature without necessarily having to paint it myself. So I like that. And salt, of course, is a very natural element to our earth. And so I feel like it's very fitting that I use salt in these painting processes. I don't always show it on video, but with every layer where I've added some salt, I usually let that layer dry completely before moving on to adding more color to the next layer. And even though I do not show it on video, I always remove the salt in between layers. So once this is done drying, I'm going to remove the salt and then I'll keep going with my process. You're going to see me now adding some ink using my fountain pen, and I usually prefer to work with a fountain pen because watercolor paper has sort of a coarse texture. And if I were to work with markers, the coarse texture of the watercolor paper would really wreak havoc on my markers. And so I wouldn't want that to happen. So using a fountain pen usually works really well. When I'm not 100% certain of what it is I want to create in terms of a design with ink, I will often start with a pencil. And so you may faintly see here that I did come in ahead of time with my pencil and I drew in what I thought I wanted to create. And this sort of just helps give me a general idea of whether or not I'm actually gonna like uh, going in that direction that I'm feeling called to go. And once I've assessed that, yep, I'm feeling it and I want to keep going with it, then I pull out my fountain pen and I get to adding the lines. A lot of the time, I work on intensifying my colors before adding any ink to my watercolor paper. Generally speaking, the ink I use is waterproof, but it really depends on how much time I have to let the ink dry fully, whether or not it'll actually work for me to add the ink and then add watercolor again to the painting. And again, for me, it's such an intuitive process. So if in this case, I really felt like I needed to test things out first, add some lines with my pencil, and then I came in with my fountain pen. And after doing that, I was like, yep, this is definitely the way I want to keep going. So then I felt more comfortable intensifying my colors, and I can do so in a more deliberate manner in this case because now I have an idea of what my final design might look like, and so I can keep moving things along in that direction. But it can always change. um, Again, because it's such an intuitive process, what I'm doing at this time will help guide what's going to happen, but it's not necessarily a decided fact that I know everything that's going to come to be in this painting before it actually is finished. So it's very much a step by step check in with my gut, see what I'm feeling like doing at every step of the journey, and then decide. And it's also how I decide whether or not my painting is finished in the end. I check in with myself, and I find that it's important for me to check in with myself. The more I check in with myself like this, the more I develop my creative intuition. And this may come as no surprise to you, but the more you check in with yourself, not only when you're creating, but the more you check in with yourself, generally speaking, in life, the more you work on developing that intuitive connection. And so the more you exercise your intuition, the stronger it usually works for you. So I check in with myself a lot when I'm working like this, and I check in with myself a lot. Generally speaking, in life, I move through life very intuitively, and I'm always seeing what my gut has to tell me because my body communicates more quickly with me sometimes than my head um, will come up in terms of thinking or analyzing things. My body will instantly give me a very sick feeling to my stomach if something doesn't feel right. And that'll happen usually much quicker than my mind can actually pick up on the fact that I'm not feeling comfortable with something. So the intuition, my intuition is something that I feel is a great tool, not only in my creative life, but in my whole life. As I'm working and I go from step to step in the painting process, I am continually asking myself, what is this painting missing? Or what could this painting use more of? And oftentimes, that's what my intuition will give me an answer to. And so I'm really like, you'll find that it almost looks like a dance. I'm working with ink, and then I'm working with color, and then I'm working with ink again. And it really always just depends on what my intuition answers me when I ask those questions. Sometimes it's going to be an answer such as I need more vibrancy in my colors, so I need to intensify my colors more. Or other times it may be that I need to add some contrast in the painting, whether it be in the form of marks, in the form of matte versus iridescent paint, or a lighter paint versus darker paint. Um, all of these are possible answers to the question, what is missing in my painting? And so I go along and ask that question to myself very, very frequently as I'm painting. And it really helps me quite a bit. You may or may not have noticed that I am working here with two different brushes. So with one paintbrush, I'm coming in and applying some color. Then I'm coming in with a second brush, and with this brush, I'm using some clean water to sort of spread that color, but not completely, just kind of like fade it out or fade it in. And that for me is a trick that I find works really well. If I were to try and do this just with one brush, it would just be too hard because I constantly have to be cleaning my brush. This way I get to have one brush that has paint on it and the other one that just has clean water. And I find that working in tandem with both these brushes works really, really well. It will come to no surprise to any of my viewers who've been with me for a long time that I love iridescent paint, and I love gold in particular, which is actually quite interesting since I don't own any gold myself. I usually tend to buy more like silver or something like that if I were to buy a ring or whatever. But I love gold in a painting, and I find that it really helps to either warm things up or add that nice little sparkle of warm color that sometimes might be missing in a painting. And when it comes to geologic abstracts, I feel like there is no better match usually than some gold. And the gold I'm using in this particular case is called classical gold. It's from this really tiny, inexpensive little palette, and I love most of the paints in this palette. In fact, I use it quite a bit, and I'm running low on at least a couple of those pans. But yeah, they're so brilliant, and they just, ooh, like even now, just looking at the painting, it's really something else how it makes everything pop. Now, I will also say this. I did off camera also add some quinacridone burnt orange to the contour of my focal point. I was feeling like the background to my painting was a little bit too dull, and I wanted to brighten things up, and that was really the perfect color to bring everything else alive. Removing the tape around my painting is usually my final check with my intuition to see whether or not I feel like the painting is finished. And when I remove the tape and get an instant gut yes, then I know I'm done. And in this case, it was definitely a huge yes. And I feel really, really happy with how this painting turned out. It's beautiful. The colors contrast well with each other, and that gold just makes everything pop. So yeah, I really love this painting. It was so much fun to create, and it really wasn't all that hard. So I hope you are feeling inspired to maybe attempt this little project on your own, because I think you'll come up with some really beautiful results as well. Well, that's it, sweet friends. I know it's the week before Christmas, and this tends to be a very hectic time of the year, so please be good to yourselves. Thank you again for making the time to join me on my creative journey. I hope you have the most wonderful week and happy creating!